How could the most powerful empire in history crumble without a single push from outside? For centuries, Rome was far more than just a city. It stood as the undisputed center of the known world, a radiant symbol of order, might, and advanced civilization. Its legendary legions seemed invincible, and its emperors almost immortal. Yet, this very entity, once believed to be eternal, found itself teetering on the precipice of ruin. This wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic invasion, nor the work of an overwhelmingly powerful external foe. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing, and persistent internal decay. The true adversary didn't emerge from beyond its borders. It already resided within Rome's very walls. Today, we will journey back to relive the epic tale of how Rome, a place where it was said gods walked among mortals, was ultimately silenced and brought low by the very peoples it once disdained. We'll encounter the Visigoths, the Vandals, and the most terrifying figure of them all, Attila, the scourge of God. Prepare yourselves for a sweeping journey through ambition, catastrophic downfall, and the definitive end of an era that forever altered the course of human destiny. But before we dive in, please remember to subscribe to the Past Chronicle channel so you don't miss our upcoming adventures. And let us know in the comments which empire you'd like to see fall in our next video. All right, historians, it's time to march on Rome. For centuries, Rome was more than just a capital city. It was the veritable heart of the world, the throbbing pulse of absolute power. Its marble columns shimmered with the reflected glory of an empire that truly believed itself to be eternal. In its grand forums, powerful orations echoed, shaping the destinies of countless nations, while its legions marched across continents as if the entire world belonged to them by divine right. Rome was invincible. Rome was immortal. But this, dear friends, is not a tale of perpetual glory. This is the story of its agonizing decline. Imagine strolling through those very cobblestone streets, surrounded by temples dedicated to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. Try to feel the sheer might of a civilization whose dominion stretched from the frigid islands of Britannia to the scorching sands of Egypt. In the Colosseum, the roar of the crowd once echoed as gladiators shed blood for honor, while in the Senate, venerable senators debated with the haughty confidence of those who believed themselves utterly invincible. And yet, the very marble blocks adorning those temples would soon be shattered. Statues of emperors, once revered as demigods, would lie broken and forgotten in the dust. And this city, which had taught the world what it meant to be an empire, would ultimately be brought to its knees by the very peoples it scornfully labeled barbarians. For Rome's collapse was not a sudden, singular event. Its disintegration was a drawn-out echo, reverberating across generations, much like a gaping wound that simply refused to heal. And at the heart of it all stood the eternal city itself, simultaneously a witness to its own unparalleled grandeur and a tragic victim of its own profound hubris. This chapter marks the chilling inception of an imperial tragedy. There will be no clear-cut heroes, nor any simplistic villains, only a civilization that soared so high it ultimately forgot how to keep its feet on the ground. And while the barbarian tribes still dwelled in their distant villages, the true threat was already walking freely within Rome's own formidable walls. What could possibly destroy a city believed to be built by gods? You're about to find out. Even as the Roman Empire's borders still tenuously held, barely clinging on, the real collapse had already taken root deep within its core. What was once a model system of organization, discipline, and unwavering loyalty had now become a machine gnawed away by insatiable greed, rampant apathy, and political chaos, an unstoppable tide that none could stem. The very economy that sustained its mighty legions and colossal architectural marvels began to fracture. Fields, exhausted by generations of overcultivation, could no longer yield sufficient harvests. Gold coinage was replaced by debased, lower-value currencies, triggering runaway inflation. Taxes increased relentlessly, becoming an unbearable burden for small farmers, who were forced to abandon their lands and seek protection under powerful landowners. Thus, unwittingly, the seeds of what would become feudalism were sown. But the rot wasn't confined to the economy alone. The Roman elite, who had once prioritized the state above personal gain, now found themselves embroiled in a perpetual, cutthroat power struggle. Each ambitious general viewed the imperial throne as a personal spoil of war, not a sacred duty. Between 235 and 284 AD, more than 20 emperors ascended to power, many of whom were eliminated by their own soldiers. The empire was no longer governed. It was contested as if it were mere plunder. Roman streets, once symbols of order and virtue, now bore witness to riots, internal looting, and a deeply disillusioned populace. Corruption seeped from the imperial palaces down to the very legions. Soldiers no longer fought for honor, but for mere survival, and distant enemies had already begun to sense the scent of weakness in the air. Rome might have appeared outwardly majestic, yet its very soul was irrevocably broken. For empires don't always fall due to external invaders. Sometimes they collapse because they cease to believe in themselves, because they have forgotten the very essence of what made them great. And while its formidable walls still stood, the true collapse had already begun. What if I told you that the very people sworn to protect Rome were the ones who unwittingly opened the gates to its own destruction? For centuries, the Roman legions had been the embodiment of imperial order, strength, and pride. But over time, maintaining such an immense fighting force became an unsustainable burden. Internal crises, depleted resources, and a growing reluctance among citizens to serve in the military forced Rome into a desperate and audacious decision: to hire its former enemies as the empire's new guardians. This is how the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Suebi, and other Germanic tribes crossed the borders, not as invading armies, but as allies. They were granted lands, food, and a place within the empire in exchange for their military service. Some arrived with their families, bearing tales of famine and displacement. What Rome considered a pragmatic solution soon proved to be a fatal miscalculation. The term barbarian was, in essence, merely a label Romans affixed to anyone who didn't live by their laws. Yet, many of these peoples possessed complex cultures, sophisticated power structures, and deeply rooted values. They were not simply wild savages. They were hardened survivors. And these barbarians had not forgotten. They hadn't forgotten the times Rome had razed their villages. They hadn't forgotten the oppressive taxes, the betrayals, and the massacres. And even though many attempted to integrate, learning Latin, donning togas, and worshiping Roman gods, they were consistently regarded as outsiders, a silent, simmering threat. The Visigoths, in particular, experienced this inherent contradiction most brutally. Treated with contempt by Roman officials and reduced to starvation and humiliation, they made a fateful decision. If they couldn't truly be a part of the empire, they would dismantle it from within. Their leader, Alaric, was no mere brutish warlord. He was a brilliant strategist, and he knew that Rome, though still majestically perched on its 7 hills, was more vulnerable than ever before. Its borders now meant little, for the enemy was no longer simply marching from the north. The enemy was already within the Roman camps, commanding troops, learning strategies, and patiently awaiting the opportune moment. And when that moment arrived, they wouldn't need to scale its formidable walls. They would simply stop obeying. On the vast eastern steppes, where winds whistled through the bleached bones of ancient warriors, a figure emerged, shrouded in legend and terror: Attila, the scourge of God. He was not Roman, not Visigoth, nor Vandal. He was a Hun, and his name, whispered by emperors and peasants alike, evoked a shudder of primal dread. Unlike the Germanic tribes, who sought land and a place within the empire, the Huns had no desire to become a part of Rome. They aimed to subjugate it entirely. Their goal was not assimilation, but utter annihilation. Wherever the Huns rode, nothing remained. Entire cities vanished from the map. Fields were scorched, and rivers ran red with blood. And at the center of this cataclysmic storm was Attila, a taciturn leader whose commands were obeyed without question. To the Romans, Attila was an anomaly. He cared little for diplomacy. He was unswayed by gold or silver, at least not for long. Esot no crowns, no temples, no taites. His sole purpose was to shatter the will of those who believed themselves invincible. In 451, the Western Roman legions allied with the Visigoths, their former adversaries, no less, to confront Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. It was a slaughter of unprecedented scale. Although Attila's advance was checked, it was hardly a decisive victory. The Scourge of God retreated, but he was far from defeated. A year later, Attila marched towards Italy. Cities fled in panic even before his arrival. Rome trembled. Pope Leo I himself went out to meet him. No one knows for certain what they discussed, only that Attila subsequently turned back. He did not sack Rome. He did not destroy the heart of the empire. Perhaps it was superstition, perhaps illness, or perhaps because it was no longer necessary. Rome, at that point, was already dying from within. Attila did not conquer Rome, but he made it taste fear. And sometimes, fear can be more potent than any sword. For centuries, Rome had been the jewel of the world. Its walls seemed impregnable, its emperor beyond reproach. For many, the very idea of Rome being sacked was an unthinkable sacrilege. But in 410 AD, that sacrilege became a horrifying reality. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, marched through the gates of the Eternal City. He didn't need to break them down, nor set them ablaze. The gates were open because the Romans themselves could no longer defend them. For 3 horrifying days, Rome was plunged into chaos. Aristocratic homes were plundered, temples desecrated, and the streets overflowed with terror. Citizens, once accustomed to looking down upon barbarians, now had to beg them for their lives. The empire that had conquered half the known world now lay prostrate before its own former allies. But that was not the only blow. Nearly half a century later, in 455 AD, a new horror descended, the Vandals. This time, the plunder was even more systematic and brutal. They loaded their ships to the brim with countless treasures, statues, and sacred relics. Gold and silver accumulated from centuries of conquest vanished beyond the African horizon. Rome was no longer the undisputed capital of the world. It was reduced to a mere shadow, plundered, deeply wounded, and utterly humiliated. Yet, the city itself did not physically disappear. Its stones remained, as did its history, but its soul had undeniably surrendered. By 476 AD, Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain, deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. There was no grand battle, no heroic resistance. Only an uneasy silence, as if Rome had finally accepted that its long era had come to an end. The empire, which had endured for over a millennium, simply vanished without a whisper of its former glory. Rome did not fall with a thunderous roar. It faded away with a quiet, lingering sigh, and the world was never the same again. The imperial eagles no longer soared above its walls. The very symbols of Rome's absolute power now lay scattered on the ground. Yet the end of the Western Roman Empire was not the end of everything. It was, rather, the dawn of something new, uncertain, and utterly chaotic. Instead of a single, unifying authority, Europe fractured. In that immense power vacuum, Germanic kingdoms emerged where Roman provinces once stood. The Visigoths established their realm on the Iberian Peninsula. The Vandals ruled North Africa. The Ostrogoths settled in Italy. Imperial order was replaced by unstable alliances, incessant warfare, and a nascent social structure, feudalism. But Rome did not vanish entirely. Its roads, its laws, and its language persisted in various forms. In monasteries, diligent monks copied ancient texts, preserving invaluable knowledge from being lost. In cities, its grand ruins became shelters for new communities. The very stones that once formed pagan temples were repurposed into Christian churches. Christianity, once persecuted by emperors, now became the backbone of the new order. The Church inherited Rome's spiritual authority and, eventually, much of its political power. The Pope assumed a position that even ancient consuls could only dream of. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as Byzantium, endured for nearly another 1,000 years, safeguarding a vital part of the Roman legacy. But the West, the very cradle of Rome, descended into what historians would later call the Middle Ages. The fall of Rome was not merely the collapse of a city or a government. It was a seismic shift in human history, marking the definitive end of antiquity and the tumultuous beginning of a new epoch. For sometimes, in order for something truly new to be born, the old must first burn down to its very foundations. Thank you all for staying with us until the very end. If you enjoyed this video and are passionate about content like this, please remember to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos and join us in exploring many more captivating stories. We'll see you in the next video.